joining us at the Venture Philanthropy panel. We've got a good panel up here, and how good the meeting is or how good the session is will depend upon how much of interaction we get from you guys. Anytime you want us to stop and ask a question, just put your hand up. We want to keep this as interactive as possible. So my name is Patricia. I have the pleasure of chairing this session today. We've got a couple of topics that we'll cover, and if we don't, feel free to ask your questions. So maybe we'll start off with introductions. If you want to go ahead and start, Daniel, just who you are, what organization you work for, and a brief kind of summary of which organization covers.
Sure. I'm Dan Smith. I'm Vice President of Innovative Technologies at Autism Speaks. It's an autism and neurodevelopment focused foundation with research, advocacy, and family services as three areas of prioritization. We funded about $500 million over the 10 years that we've been online, and much of that in scientific research, basic as well as applied, from preclinical, molecular, through to later stage clinical POC trials of medicines, and lots of behavioral intervention work along the way. Based in Boston, and we do have an interest in facilitating the development of products that improve quality of life in healthcare, biological side, so in life sciences, so devices, diagnostics, therapeutics, and then also in technology, so assistive technologies and other types of electronic medicine, let's say, are on our radar. Trying to pull companies into our space or help them be successful is certainly part of our mission.
Hi, I'm Lindy with Breakout Labs, and we are a revolving seed stage fund that runs out of the Teal Foundation. And we fund early stage, hard science, hard tech companies with a vehicle that's easiest thought about as a convertible grant. So we're using operating dollars from the foundation, and we only fund companies, so we don't fund research. The company needs to be formed. And we're often the first money in, up to about $350,000 to work against very specific technical, scientific milestone. The intention being that if you're able to achieve that milestone, we then work with our companies for about 2 to 3 years to help connect them with follow-on funders, other resources. We have a strong connection amongst our company CEOs. So we fund 8 to 10 companies a year. We've got 26 in our portfolio now, primarily at the intersection of biology and technology. We also do some new materials and some energy in there. And our core criteria is that there really is a significant scientific breakthrough, scientific advance at the root of the company, often operating in a platform type approach where you've got lots of different avenues to ultimately pursue.
I'm Patricia. I'm the Chief Drug Development Officer for Foundation Fighting Blindness. Our mission is to accelerate the development of treatment of disease of the retina due to gene mutations. So we have a science part who funds grants, award, early stage, and then there's the part I'm in charge of, which is the Clinical Research Institute, where the strategy is to invest in small companies or early stage company up to $7 million. We don't do much equity, only if we have to, we try to have a return. The goal again is to help this treatment to go to the patient as quickly as possible. To help with the exit, we do build a lot of relationship with Big Pharma, with Sanofi, and with Shire mainly. And we also work on validation of new clinical endpoint, because in our field that's really where we have a huge gap. So working very closely with the FDA and with the NIH as well.
Hi, I'm Rachel Rimsky. I'm an Associate Director at the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. So we're a Parkinson's research investment organization. Since we were founded in 2000, we've invested over $500 million with the sole goal of curing Parkinson's. We oftentimes say we're going to cure Parkinson's and then go out of business. We fund symptomatic and disease-modifying therapies, as well as a very significant focus on biomarkers, which in the Parkinson's research field is one of the huge challenges to moving forward. So we fund through the target discovery, validation, and optimization phase, all the way through phase 1 and phase 2, with the goal then to attract follow-on funders or a larger multiplier effect on our funding. We don't run with an endowment, so 89 cents of every dollar that we raise every single year is funded out to research. with the goal of being increasing the efficiency and the speed with which Parkinson's is cured. We funded about 420 grants in 2015, and in general, we run with about 450 active grants all the time. We work pretty constructively with our awardees, with the goal being establish milestones. All of our grants or awards are structured around milestone payments, and then we actively work with our awardees once the grant is completed if we find that there is sufficient information that can be utilized broadly in the field, or to attract additional funding to then move the research process forward.
Thank you. And I'm with Broadview Ventures. So we're a philanthropic venture firm. We make investments. We take an equity stake, but we have a single LP family foundation out of Paris that gives us money to invest. So our investments are very mission-based. We only invest in cardiovascular, metabolic, and stroke. And the goal is really to help with the $1 million that we invest. The goal is really to help companies cross over that gap that most companies at some point in time in their company life cycle face, to get them to cross that gap so they're better positioned to raise their next round. So for us, it's all about doing well and doing good, but more importantly, it's about doing good. While we're strictly focused on cardiovascular, metabolic, and stroke, we are very agnostic to technology. So we have therapeutics, we have devices, we have regenerative, so most of the companies that we get into, we generally tend to be, but not always, but we generally tend to be the first investment dollar going in for that. We're Boston-based, and so I think the commonality of here, we've got some foundations, some investors, but I think the commonality of here is it's all philanthropic dollars, which is why we have the title Venture Philanthropy. But rather than go into the discussion on how do you define venture philanthropy, it would be nice to hear from each of your organizations as to how you use your philanthropic dollars. How do you invest, and how do you structure investments in terms of taking that philanthropic dollars and moving and advancing your mission forward? So, Rich, if you want to start that and put that this way.
Sure, happy to. So we approach venture philanthropy in a pretty interesting way. So we don't ask for any equity in any dollars that we utilize to fund. We don't ask for any royalties, any equity stakes. We don't ask for a revenue share. We fund with the primary focus of moving the field of research forward. By placing people with Parkinson's in the center of our funding decisions, as opposed to seeking some type of P&L or payback, we're able to take a holistic view of the field and take on high-risk projects that other funders may not necessarily be able to do. And the goal, generally, when we seek these projects, is to learn. So should the project fail, if we believe that there could be some learning from the project that will advance the Parkinson's scientific research field forward, we're very happy to take it on, to be able to utilize that for a broader learning purpose. I should also just add that about 30% of our funding goes to industry. So we work pretty constructively and cohesively with academics, with industry, with smaller pharma companies as well as biotechs. We utilize CROs pretty often, particularly when it's biomarker type work, or when it's something that's in the target phase. If we're looking to validate, replicate a study, we'll often work with CROs to be a neutral partner and help collaborate across different researchers that might otherwise see themselves as competitors, but this allows them to operate in a pre-competitive consortium-type fashion.
So you're mainly giving out grants then with no back-end requirements or no back-end commitments or obligations?
Exactly. We give out grants. The only exception I would note is every once in a while, when we're working with a for-profit company, we'll structure into a grant that should the research we're funding ultimately be at market, we request a grant repayment.
Okay.
So it's very well defined from day one.
So for us, if it's science early stage, it's going to be a grant and award with no reimbursements. If it's a project which is ready to go into IND enabling, we will do ask for return on investment. It's going to be a multiplier at the time of exit or at the time of change of control. We are flexible because our mission is really not to fund company. We want to fund projects, so we don't like to go in the equity business. We want to fund the project and have control of the project. So we make fund before the company is created or with another partner if a company is created. Right now I'm working on a project where we're funding a company with two other partners. One is a VC and the other one is a big bank. So it's flexible. The main goal is really to get the project moving forward.
So we're probably a bit different in the sense that we are not a foundation that's founded around solving or addressing a particular disease or a particular healthcare area. We are looking at fundamentally advancing science out of the lab and into the economy, into people's lives, and into our environment. And so we look across advanced technologies. And if we have something in our portfolio that looks a lot like you, then we probably don't want another one, which is different than foundations that are focused in a particular area. So our portfolio is actually quite broad in that way. And in pursuing that, we've really come up with a system to do seed stage investing at scale. So we have a two-step proposal process. The first is a pre-proposal. It's really the first 10 questions someone should ask you if you said you've had a scientific breakthrough and you're starting a company. We review that internally about 7 to 10 days. Then on things that we think might be a fit for us, we request a full proposal, which is much more around the background of the science and also how you would spend our fairly limited money, if it's $350,000, and what endpoint you would hope to achieve with that, the team that's behind the company. And part of the bet and what we're looking at that point is there a team and an endpoint that can be reached with our funding and maybe an SBIR and a little more coming in, that you could then effectively go in the market and raise the next money that you're going to need to move forward. As I mentioned, we funded with a convertible grant. So if things don't work, it was a grant. There's no repayment. If you move on to a Series A, Series B equity type financing, then the grant is basically exchanged at a discount at that round of financing, and we become shareholders. And we have a small capped royalty that pays back 3x the grant. In addition to the funding, we know that startups need a lot more than just cash. So a big part of what we do is a 2-year program of support and connections for our companies, working to connect them with follow-on funders, strategic partners, and with a network of early-stage hard science CEOs. So as you're experiencing, some of you, right, it can be a lonely business. So the programmatic piece of what we do is a big part of our value in the market also.
Yeah, I think without reiterating what's been said, we do replicate some of these models to a large extent, and we also give out grants. We will seek a modest financial ROI. Maybe it's just the return of the grant. Maybe it's some cap royalty. That is secondary completely to us feeling like there's a return on mission. So the concept, the company, we've got to buy into the idea that you bring something transformative forward for quality of life or healthcare improvement. So I'd say that's our sort of double bottom line model. We also bring forward support. So we're finding that in most conversations, it's not so much the dollars that bring us to the table, but our content area expertise, our representation of the patient community, our ability to engage the patient community or help you engage the patient community for multiple reasons is largely, I think in most cases, the most important reasons why we were brought into a dialogue. The funding is in most cases secondary, and in our case it would be more seed stage level. Our idea is that there is certainly a gap in that sequence of events in early stage companies for funding opportunities, particularly where we're looking at opportunities that target the autism population or neurodevelopmental populations, and we feel that we might be able to assess risk or the potential for early stage concepts to cross some milestones that then, upon success, might attract larger funding organizations to take concepts further.
So at Broadview, we make investments, we don't give out grants. That said, if there is no valuation on the table, we'll do a convertible note. If there's valuation, we'll buy into the equity. Our goal is really to get things moving as fast as possible. We take an equity stake and we sit on the board as an observer, the goal being to help these companies move things forward. So we spend about 60% of our time with our portfolio companies. But we're strictly investors, and that, for more important than financial return, that sets up a mindset that we are not giving out grants. We are like an investor, so think of it as we're the first investors coming in, and that gets the company into gear to think about what the next investor is going to want, and so it sets a mindset in a corporate environment that will help them raise their next round when the VCs and the other investors come in. So let me stop with here, and someone had a question of here. Go ahead.
It's actually a question for Rachel. So you said that about 30% of your money goes to industry and only 70% to academia?
Yes, that's correct.
So is that stable generally year to year? Or is that fluctuating? I guess where I'm getting at is, so you're just trying to deploy money to get the job done, and then you're feeling like that much of it goes to academic as a function of where the field is, and you think it shifts over time as things mature and you get more money to industry because it's closer to the patient? Or, you know, it's an interesting way of looking at it.
So I
and
should,
you have data on it.
yeah, no, I should clarify. So 30% goes to industry, the balance goes to nonprofit or governmental work as well. So we work pretty constructively with the NIH when it comes to certain areas of research. We are agnostic to who we're funding. The data does show that about 25 to 30% has ended up with industry. That number is based on where we found research over time. So another similar example of how we're agnostic is when thinking about geography. So we fund about 25 to 30% actually as well outside of the United States. We have a RFA process very similar to actually what Lindy was describing earlier. So ours is a twice-a-year process. We end up seeing, over the past few years, it's found 1,000 grants annually that we end up seeing through that process. So we get a pretty good view of where the field is looking. We drive a smaller part of the RFA process by specifically calling out something of interest. So past examples have been GATE, LRRK2, the protein target, dyskinesia was an RFA we called out. So in some ways we drive the field in certain aspects, but by and large it's actually a pretty open call. So we have a large pre-proposal process that's run through the RFA, and then we specifically ask for full proposals from applications that we believe we might want to fund. And yes, the data does lay out that it's about 30% in industry, which is research that we're looking to fund. So as I mentioned earlier, we fund really throughout the process of target discovery all the way through phase 1, phase 2, with the goal then of attracting larger dollars of capital, which is why we don't take equity, et cetera. We want to build the best data package we can, and we've always felt that if we take equity or some sort of revenue share, that would then detract from a follow-on funder. So when it comes to the earlier stage grants, we give many multiples of the larger phase 1, phase 2 type grants, and they're in smaller amounts. They're between $100,000 and $200,000 when it comes to the target discovery and optimization areas. And then as we go more towards translational in the clinic, it's larger amounts of money and it's less grants that we're making.
Question for Patricia. So in the, is there a particular type of blindness that you deploy your capital to, and is there a specific region? So what I'm thinking of is technologies in Africa for like blinding glaucoma or similar areas like that. Is that something that you look at?
So in terms of focus on the disease, we only focus on disease of the retina due to gene mutation, like RP, Stargardt disease, Usher. So glaucoma would not fit in that category, AMD would not, treatment for Africa would not. In terms of geographic region, we don't care as long as it's a treatment which can go to commercialization and be accessible for patients in the US as well.
Someone else had a question?
So no AMD?
No AMD. We do fund early stage, so I represent here the venture part, so focus on any asset which goes into IND enabling phase. The early stage science, identification of being candidate or development of animal models, we would fund AMD there through grants. And the rationale behind is there is an overlap between dry AMD and between Stargardt disease. But in terms of clinical, we don't fund late stage because the clinical in AMD industry is already spending a bunch of money in it. And these studies are $50–60 million a study. There's no way we want to do
So Richard's response raised an interesting point. So Lindy, I presume you have a single LP, right? The Theo Foundation.
Yes.
Yeah, and then we have a single LP, so we sort of know how much money we're getting every year. But among the foundations, I mean, how do you balance longer? How do you make decisions? You're doing it on a rolling basis, so with Parkinson's Foundation do it twice a year. And then how do you balance long-term commitments when you have to raise money every year, right? And get that done.
So for us, it's actually a pretty simple answer, so I'll take the first stab at it. Every commitment that we raise, we utilize the dollars that we're raising that year. So we make the commitment once we have the dollars in the bank, and we basically farm out the dollars as kind of pretty efficiently, generally within 6 months of it being raised. But once we commit fully to a project, we ensure we actually have all the dollars on hand before committing to it. So we hold actually a significant cash balance.
So how much do you fund in a year, ballpark?
In 2015, we funded just under $75 million, including commitments over multiple years.
Same thing for us, we only commit money but we put in the bank. I mean, there's no obvious mistakes. But per year on your question, it really depends. I mean, you don't have an asset or a new company you create every month. So, and it's a long process, as you know, to create a new code. Sometimes it takes a year. So, and it depends how much we're going to fund. It can be up to $7 million. So, I cannot answer your question, but it's pretty significant.
Yeah, always good practice to stick with what's in the bank, but you know, we've gone outside of that on occasion and initiated fundraising activities around a specific project. We feel it's good fodder for that type of activity. Get our team involved in something direct. Otherwise, similar answer from us.
Do any of your foundations fund patient access to new devices or technologies where insurance companies are not that have policies around covering a new intervention, or patients don't have health insurance coverage? Do you have set aside any funds or are connected to others in your particular fields that would do that for individuals who can't afford purchasing the new devices?
We've done this to some extent around assistive technology devices, for example, making some of those things available. Those aren't really going down the regulatory reimbursement pathway anyway, but still making sure that they're available to individuals and families and groups that couldn't afford them otherwise, yes. But we do, in our terms, often, irrespective of the type of application we're talking about, we'll often seek terms that X percentage of previous year's sales, if this product makes it to market, is dedicated toward matching giveaways or cost reductions for a specific population. Maybe those are individuals that are Medicaid eligible or something like that. So we'll try to address access in creative ways wherever we can.
Yeah, so I think it's a terrific question. It's a huge unmet need. We haven't historically done that at the Fox Foundation. The way we've approached that is actually probably 2 or 3-fold. So firstly, we've done broad education for payers. We did a broad seminar about a year ago, and we're planning to do another one this year to really educate the payer community on unmet needs on the symptomatic side, where the disease-modifying research is today, as well as biomarkers and clinical endpoints that we're working towards in exciting research. The other piece is, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. The other piece is big data. Thank you. So we're working through some consortium and committees that are focused both on the regulatory side as well as the payer side to think about how we can standardize the big data that's in the Parkinson's field to then provide that data to payers and to regulators, both in terms of clinical endpoints and in terms of understanding the unmet need and then ultimately providing insurance payback. So we've taken it at a more of a top-down level as opposed to a bottom-up level, which is more just when we think about holistically the field, how we can advance it most efficiently. That's the answer we came to. It's not necessarily the right answer today, given that there is a significant unmet need.
So for us, it's kind of the same thing. We don't fund patients. We don't pay. Our mission is to develop treatment. However, we start to do a little bit what Michael Fox is doing. We start to educate the payer because we expect gene therapy to be available this year for a subgroup of patients more interested in, and we are afraid that the cost is going to be very, very expensive, and it's not our mission to pay for it, but try to educate the payer more and more. We are starting to be more proactive here.
One right back.
So I actually have a question for Lindy. You mentioned that your scope is broader. So I hope you can share with us how do you deal with the challenge that anyone interested in more broader impact investing has to weigh impact within opportunities. We make financial investments, returns here, returns there, that's what we pursue. But we're trying to have positive impact with it. What do you actually compare among opportunities? Measures of suffering, life, how broad, I mean, how do you think about weighing opportunities to influence things and support different technologies and novel innovation?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I would say we don't often wrap what we're doing in the sort of more traditional impact investing language, in the sense that, and I don't know, maybe this is too simple for some, but we basically see companies and scientists as entrepreneurs as the agents of change. And so for us, a successful company that is able to develop a product, a therapeutic, a diagnostic, a service tool, whatever it is that they're developing, they have to actually be able to build a successful business in order to deliver that to the market. And so our review is around, is this a significant scientific breakthrough? If it were to work, would it matter? Right? This isn't incremental. And is this a team and the setup of a structure in a market that has a shot at actually being a successful business? And so for us, that's the lens we're looking at, believing that that successful business is what it's going to take to ultimately make an impact on whatever field it is they're working in and in the economy in general.
If I just follow, so the execution, that's very natural, right? When you say, does it matter? So how do you define merit? I mean, is it, children from adults, women from men, people in developing countries from developed countries?
So for us, I would say we're probably focusing on developing the developed world, candidly, in the sense that we're working at the absolute cutting edge of science and technology. So it is not first going to be necessarily the most cost-effective or deployed, right, in a really efficient global manner. So being at that cutting edge of science, it really is looking at opportunities to leverage breakthroughs that are ready to leave the lab and make a real run at commercialization. And so we've looked at, we're not typically going to engage in opportunities where you've taken existing technology and you've turned the widgets around differently, and maybe that is a really interesting med device and it might have a market and it should come to pass. We wouldn't engage there in the sense that we're really looking for there to be brand new, breakthrough, new way of looking at a problem, two disciplines that have come together for the first time, there being a fairly radical lens on the science or the technology that's being developed.
I'd echo that, because we are along the same path, because we don't have to make a financial return. Our goal is really to go and invest in innovation, and innovation by nature is very risky, and so the goal is to de-risk it to the extent that we can, so that the next investor is a little bit more comfortable coming in. So we typically, just to give you an example, would not invest in another stent, because that's an incremental improvement. But if there is some way of avoiding using a stent altogether, that could be a huge, very big, impactful. Or we have a company doing gastric bypass without surgery, right? So that's a huge, very risky. We don't know if it'll work, but that's what we do. We go and help de-risk it. So it's really about revolutionary, not evolutionary, and we see a lot of those of the latter. So, anyone else wants to add to? Any other questions? Sure.
Just to follow up on this point, what's the appetite for early stage platform technologies which could be used across your areas? But people always say, well, this is not for blindness, or this is not for Parkinson's, but they could all be useful for different things. And our challenge is always going to, we've got something that is really break through.
Sure.
But it's difficult to get that hook. And so what do you suggest, or how do you suggest we approach it?
So I'll add. So our experience there has been funding those platform type companies, which we have a handful of. And candidly, the challenge of them placing them in the more specific niches, I would agree. And so we actually do have a company that was funded by Fox this year. And so I think that to get into the more specific niches and compete with those, right, that huge amount, thousands of proposals, you've got to have data at that point that is head on. You're not going to get through the noise of the more specific funders. Because that's been a challenge for a handful of our companies. And they've had to develop to the point where they could make a real claim in a particular indication to then go work in the more specific pots.
Enabling technologies we would invest, but if you've got a platform that could potentially develop drugs in different areas or devices in different areas, we'd be happy to invest as long as that project is specifically related to cardiovascular metabolic. So it's up to you then to come to us and not with a platform, but rather an application of the platform that meets our mission.
Yeah, and it's an appealing concept in that if you were to bring together various investors or organizations, the case for being a force magnifier is always a great bullet point to have when you're trying to pitch ideas internally at a mission-driven foundation. So making your dollars go further and platforms are among the places where I've probably seen that happen the most frequently.
Yeah, same for us. There's an opportunity. I mean, where we have a huge gap, it's delivery platform to take drugs to the back of the eye. Today there is a huge gap, so if there is something that with our funding will help our therapeutic area, we would fund it.
I think similarly, I'm very happy Lindy kind of took that question first. And I think it speaks very well to what we're good at. So we're really good at taking on high-risk projects where we see a defined source of education for the Parkinson's field. We're not very good at being creative when someone comes to us with something that's not currently well-defined for Parkinson's.
A couple of questions. One at the back. You. There you go.
Can you talk a little bit about your relationships with more traditional ventures? So are you completely orthogonal in the types of projects that you're looking at, or are there simply co-investments or follow-on?
So I like to work with our ventures because I prefer their money than our money. The problem is our mission is not quite the same. Our mission is to get the treatment to the patient as quickly as possible. Venture, we like to make profit. We like to make money too, but it's not our priority. So, but I like to work with because it gives us synergy for the due diligence, and then also if we create a new co, they have all the people, the skill set, the expertise to help us for a new co. But it's at the exit that sometimes it's more difficult because we are not always in agreement. But overall, we like to work with them and we try to make it work. So we talk about 15, 20 million, at least in our field. To get a project to phase 2, it's about $15 to $20 million. So it's a significant amount of money.
We've had success. We've had success in JVs or co-relationships where it's us and a large pharma that are both funding a smaller academic or a smaller pharma, or an academic or a smaller pharma. We haven't partnered with investors or VCs. What we've done is introductions, education of the VC community, which is something we're actually very focused on this year, and historically we've provided kind of a linkage at times. But anything that's more formal or structured than that, we haven't heard in. And it's pretty similar to the response Patricia gave, where we're not interested in the P&L behind it, so it would just lead to different motivations.
So we see our dollars as very early catalyzing dollars in the sense that ideally you're hitting a milestone that then helps bring the next pot of money to the table, which we're not overly enamored with venture, but it often is going to be venture, and that's where the money is. So we spend a lot of our time meeting and understanding and building our network of venture investors and understanding what they're looking for, and then as much as possible being able to introduce our companies at the appropriate times so that they can move forward in those relationships. So we've seed funded 26 companies. 1 has been acquired and 7 have moved on to close the Series A, and now we've been at it long enough that we're moving into Series B this year, which is a big new step for us. So for us, venture as catchers of what we seed fund is a very important part of the model.
Yeah, I would say the same thing. So again, this idea of being a force magnifier or catalyzing activity with our dollars and expertise and network is paramount. So we would not have hesitation to partnering. We have done one deal with a venture-backed firm where they picked up a good chunk of the back end of the project that we initiated. So there's certainly precedent and it works.
Yeah, and for us, so at the end of the day, we want to get to the patient, but there's several steps along the way, and that involves multiple other investors. So we spend a lot of our time building relationships with the VC community for the medtech, the diagnostic, etc., and then with the pharma community for the therapeutics, because as you can imagine, if you're developing a drug for heart failure or for atrial fibrillation, these require outcome studies which involve tens of thousands of patients, and that's really big pharma remit. And so we spend a lot of our time building these relationships so that we can take our portfolio companies over to these potential next investors or licensees to get the program moving, because no matter how much money we put in, $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, we're not going to be successful if our portfolio companies don't make that progression. So we're still early. We just started in 2009. We have 27 companies in the portfolio. We've had a couple of exits, but really the metric that we are using is that for every dollar that we have invested, our portfolio is currently raising about $7 in co-investments, follow-on, and grants. So that means they are making progress and moving their programs forward as the additional money comes in. So that's very important. We spend a lot of time over that. Any other questions before we? So, because unlike traditional VCs, we're not necessarily looking for a financial return, how do you measure success? How do you measure the success of your investments? How do you know you're doing well?
It's certainly going to vary by the type of opportunity, but it's in our case, if it's in medical research, it's going to be functional outcomes. So we'll look to clinical trials and what types of metrics seem to correlate or indicate whether there's a functional real-world improvement. The business metric side of things are probably a little easier to measure, and they're certainly a good proxy for product access in the market and customers being able to access that product for benefits. So we'll look for those metrics as well. We want to see that the company, that based on our investment, maybe they've achieved additional investments, Series A, Series B, et cetera, made it to commercialization, and then ultimately we will look to see whether our upfront analysis on potential functional improvement came to pass.
I think ours is pretty clear-cut in the sense that our companies are going to need to raise more money after our investment in order to continue to develop. So we're constantly looking at our company's ability to typically first raise their SBIR grant, which our companies generally get about 30 to 40% of the time, which is higher than the market. So looking at how they can bring in non-dilutive capital, generally raising $1 million, $1.5 million on a convertible note, and then they're at that decision point of do they have something and there's a race to Series A or some type of collaboration with a strategic. And so for us, the key metrics are they hit the scientific or technological milestone that we funded, because if that didn't work, then there's probably nothing to keep going on, which is also okay because we've learned something. But for those that have hit that milestone, then it really is looking at their ability to raise the follow-on capital. And ultimately, the measure will be bringing those products or services to market. But as you know, it's a long lead time to get there, so we're not quite there. We've got some betas in the market now.
Yeah.
So for us, ideally, it would be have treatment approved by the FDA, but it's not the case yet. So it's the number of treatment going to clinic. How we get them to the clinic can be for NewCo, or either we are funding an early stage project or we are attracting a company in our field. Success for us is pretty good right now because 4 years ago we had 0 clinical trial in our field. Today I think there are about 35 which are listed on clinicaltrial.gov. So for me it's a good success now. But we know not every clinical is going to be a success, but we're getting there.
Yeah, so for us as well, success is finding a cure for Parkinson's. 2015 saw, I think, 4 clinical trials for disease-modifying therapies, which was the first we've seen, which is incredibly exciting. And until then, we measure success based on building a data package, working on milestones. So if you approach a milestone and the expected hypothesis isn't bearing out the way that you initially thought, constructively reworking the hypothesis with us. We then do actively work with people to either provide our own follow-on funding if we believe the research continues to be interesting, or to try to attract additional dollars. So to continue to provide the Parkinson's scientific research field with actionable data, I guess would be our kind of secondary metric, and then the primary metric is obvious.
Yeah, our field, unlike putting together an app for your iPhone, which probably takes 6 weeks or 6 months, it takes at least 6, 7, 8 years to develop something to market. Eventually, we'd love to be able to have a slide that shows here's the dollars we've invested and here's the lives that it's impacted. We're quite far from there right now. We do have a company that has an approved product and is getting commercialized in Europe. But right now, as I mentioned earlier on, some of the metrics that we're looking at is if you look at an annual report every year, here's the number of programs that had their first demand, for example. Big, huge milestone, right? Because you're going from the lab into the clinic. That's a big milestone. $7 for every dollar that we've invested, they're raising $7, and those are all metrics that we use. So that's what we're using in the short term, because we are in a development cycle that takes a decade, if not longer than that. So those are the metrics. So what do you find are the challenges in terms of raising money and then investing that money, and relative to the sort of metrics that you have? Where do you see your challenges are specifically related to each of your organizations?
My biggest challenge, my biggest frustration on a daily basis is when there is an asset which comes from an academic centers and we try to create a new core. And the scientists, the academic center has no idea what commercialization means. They have no idea what GMP means. They have no idea what GMP means. And they have no idea of timelines, but we think that they have a promising treatment. We want to create a new core. We found a partner with a VC, and we have to get the lead scientists moving forward. That's my nightmare.
Our biggest challenge by far is biomarkers. So currently there are no biomarkers to mark a clinical endpoint. Our biggest focus is imaging, so being able to see engagement in the brain. That would be a huge, huge game changer. It would provide more efficient clinical trials, more efficient general research. It would ensure that we're selecting the right participants for clinical trials, so that we can ensure the results are true results. And from a regulatory and payer perspective, it would be incredibly significant.
I echo the challenge of scientists as entrepreneur. It's definitely something we're cheering for, and I think that there is a new beast growing out there, which is scientists that is ready to also be entrepreneur. Unfortunately, there's a lot of scientists that should be scientists, and when they make a run at building a company, it's not usually ideal. So we're balancing that at times, and who the right people are to lead companies. And then I think the biggest challenge is for follow-on funders in our markets, there's not a lot of incentive to step up and go first. Unfortunately, there's a lot of incentive to keep stepping back and saying, I'd like to see a little bit more, and a little bit more, and a little bit more. And for early stage companies, the endpoint that they think they're racing towards often keeps moving backwards, and that's hard. And continuing to raise money, and I'm sure some of you have experienced this, from the bigger players who they're always happy to see more and see more data, is probably the biggest challenge.
I think managing expectations for us, so that development process obviously takes a very, very long time, and the community often has very, very urgent needs that aren't going to be met in the near term, and we do raise funds publicly, and making that pitch that your investment now will drive the future is a pitch that doesn't always fall on receptive ears. It's a tough one to make, but it is transformative ultimately. Otherwise, in our particular space, diagnostics, biomarkers, and treatment outcomes measures and treatments themselves are probably the greatest challenge. Autism is neurodevelopmental conditions that relate to it are very, very diverse. We need different diagnostics and different treatments for different types of individuals. Some individuals don't need treatments at all, but need other types of maybe assistive technologies to support living. So I'd say the diversity of the population and their needs, and finding the right solutions to address all of those is probably the number one challenge. The second is really managing expectations and keeping the community engaged, even when you're talking about a maybe a more long-term deliverable.
And while we are privileged with having an LP that has a very long-term focus and long-term commitment, as I had mentioned earlier on, we're only going to be successful if the programs continue to move forward, and getting that second round, getting that third round of investors or a pharma company to come in always continues to be a challenge. And as Lindy said, everyone always wants more data, but that's the nature of the business. Questions before we wrap up? One last shot, Jim.
So each of you are organizations operating pursuant to a mission-based mandate. Some nonprofit funding projects with grant funding mechanisms, others for-profits using equity investment. Can you offer any commentary about the notion of nonprofits doing equity investment with for-profit motive? And more fundamentally, do you see merit for nonprofits to embrace the best practices of venture capital investment as a means of the pursuit of their mandate?
Sure.
So nonprofits can invest, and they can invest with the same lens of sort of value that we would expect traditional venture to invest, but it also has to be that they're doing it within a wrapper of why it's relevant to their mission. The limits are not on making a profit. So if you were to make an investment in blindness and successfully treat blindness and make $1 billion along the way, right, that is not inherently a problem in a nonprofit structure. I actually think there's a lot more opportunities for nonprofits and foundations to be more flexible in how they view that. And that the distinction for us is, are you funding research and a science project which has a very different endpoint and goal, and then if you say you're funding companies which then are held to what does it take to be a successful company. And so I think the distinction that you see, and the distinction that's important, is clarity on, are you intending to fund research, or are you intending to fund companies and companies' growth? And that gets muddled sometimes.
I think if we had the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation represented here, it'd be a fantastic example of thinking through that and the reality of what happens. And it's certainly a two-sided. There's a lot of tension around that. We haven't done an equity deal, but we wouldn't rule one out in part, again, as a mechanism to further drive the funding of the philanthropic mission of the foundation itself. So that's certainly a day in of itself, probably, of dialogue. But again, if it comes back to funding the philanthropic goals, I would personally land on the side of that being justified, to justify terms for financial ROI.
And as been said, there's no reason why a not-for-profit can't make a profit as long as that profit is used again. And with foundations, it's thriving. Cystic fibrosis is a great example. With Broadview, the family is in fact giving out grants now to the sum of $350 million in pure academic grants with no requirements, no IP ownership or any of that. That's strictly to drive the science forward. Our goal is more psychological, and to one extent, because it sets up a mindset that this is not a grant. You have requirements to deliver a financial return. And even though we may not want that financial return or require that, remember the next investor is going to have that. So it's setting them up to have that mindset. Secondly, if we're not averse to, we love to make money, and because simply all the money that we make will probably just go right back into funding more companies. And so so it allows us to become evergreen. So in that sense, it's a mindset issue, because now when we sit on the boards, we sit as investors versus I give you a grant, come back to me when your paper's published. So that it's more of a mindset. And yeah, if the money comes in, we'll take it and we'll continue to reinvest. So.
The other piece, if I could just add quickly on cystic fibrosis comment, I think what's pretty material to consider is in that example, it was actually funded by the foundation to the tune of $75 million over multiple years. So they were funding it to drive the research forward, not with the goal necessarily of attracting follow-on funding. Whereas I think our panelists today, myself included, are very focused on the follow-on funding concept. And so from a nonprofit disease-oriented research foundation, when your primary objective is follow-on funding, you have a very different mindset than if you're willing to commit the dollars over time to see a project through clinical trial.
So just to end up quickly, what should this crowd here who is probably interested in raising money be aware of, and how should they approach each of you? Just quick, Blair.
I'd say in addition to maybe a financial opportunity, the foundations have a lot of other deep expertise and resources from the table, and might be something that's overlooked at times. In part, maybe the critical path doesn't seem to accommodate that kind of interaction, but some of us can work with you pretty quickly and pretty effectively. I'd say that mission case could go a long way for your business as well. I think in many cases it makes business sense, not just maybe sense for your conscience, but something to keep in mind.
So it's not just money.
Yeah,
access. Yep. Rachel?
Yeah, so I would definitely echo Dan's comments. We have 11 PhDs on staff, and we're always very welcome and open to having conversations and thinking through different types of ideas and help that we can give. And the other piece I would mention is just what I mentioned earlier as well. We fund industry, we actively fund wherever we find exciting research. We're very open to high-risk, interesting projects if we find that there could be a way to drive the Parkinson's scientific research field forward, which is our primary objective.
So I would say about the same thing. I mean, I didn't talk too much about that, but we have a network of about 30 executives from ophthalmology. So we have we can have huge access to expertise and drug development in our field. Plus the money, I mean, we can be a true partner if you have an asset which you think can bring value to our therapeutic field.
Yeah, we'll fund 8 to 10 new companies this year. So we are always looking for new proposals and looking for referrals of folks that you interact with that might be relevant for the way that we fund. And we're always on the lookout for follow-on funders that are interested in picking up and advancing the types of early stage breakout labs companies that we work with.
And if you're in the cardiovascular metabolic space, we want to talk to you. Okay. With that, let me take this opportunity to thank the panel.